In 1944, after the fall of Saipan and the Mariana Islands, over 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war were transferred to detention camps on the continental United States. The U.S. War Department implemented the Geneva Conventions rigorously, providing abundant food and proper medical treatment for the prisoners. The ice cream slowly melted on Hiroshi Takeda's trembling spoon. 5 months earlier, he had commanded an imperial unit in Saipan. Now, at prisoner of war Camp 314 in Arkansas, he faced what he considered the most bewildering of humiliations: American kindness. His superiors had prepared him for torture, forced labor, perhaps even death. Never for organized lines, hearty meals, and a cold dessert symbolizing abundance in times of total war. The Lost War Files, the ice cream that shook Bushido, reveals how a simple culinary gesture could challenge decades of military indoctrination. The war, the prisoners would discover, was also fought in small acts of humanity. The train screeched to a halt, its metallic sound echoing across the Arkansas plain like a weary iron sigh. Through the barred windows, Hiroshi Takeda saw the American landscape for the first time. Cotton fields stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with wooden barns that looked like dollhouses compared to the temples of his homeland. Sweat ran down his thin face, mixing with the dust from the 3-day journey from the San Francisco port. His men remained in absolute silence as they had been taught, but Takeda could feel the fear radiating from their tense bodies. The defeat at Saipan still burned in their minds like an open wound, and now they would face the fate that imperial propaganda had painted with nightmare colors. American guards walked along the platform, but their faces showed no expected cruelty, only a professional efficiency that, in some way, disturbed him more than any display of hatred. The gates of Camp 314 opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a sight that defied all the expectations built up over years of indoctrination. White-painted wooden barracks stood in perfect rows, separated by gravel streets where small improvised gardens grew. There were no watchtowers with machine guns pointed at them, just barbed wire fences that looked more like rural property boundaries than POW camps. The air carried the smell of fresh bread from the central kitchen, a scent that made the prisoners' empty stomachs tighten painfully. Takeda clenched his fists, interpreting this apparent normalcy as a refined method of psychological torture. The Americans, he thought, were more subtle than he'd imagined. They were preparing them for a more brutal fall, luring them in first with the illusion of civility. Captain Robert Hayes, the commanding officer of the camp, waited in the central courtyard, dressed in an immaculate but unostentatious uniform. He was a middle-aged man, with graying hair and blue eyes that studied the newcomers with professional interest, not contempt. When he began to speak in rudimentary Japanese, some prisoners raised their eyebrows in surprise. It was rare to find Americans who bothered to learn their language. His words were simple but direct. They would follow the rules of the Geneva Convention, receive 3 meals a day, medical care, and could write home once a month. The offer sounded so impossible that Takeda almost laughed. Surely it was a trick, an elaborate setup to break their moral resistance. However, something in the officer's calm demeanor planted a seed of doubt in his disciplined mind. The first night in the barracks passed in tense silence, punctuated only by occasional snoring and muffled moans from men dreaming of home. Takeda stayed awake, lying on a bunk that, to his surprise, had a clean mattress and enough blankets. Through the window, he could see the soft lights that illuminated the paths of the camp, creating an almost domestic atmosphere. His ears, trained to detect danger, picked up only the nighttime sounds of local wildlife: crickets, distant owls, the whisper of the wind through the cotton fields. There were no screams of torture, no heavy footsteps of guards on patrol. This calm unsettled him more than any explicit brutality. The Americans were playing a sophisticated psychological game, he concluded, and he needed to be prepared to resist any trap they planned. The real battle, he suspected, had only just begun. When the morning bell rang at 6 o'clock, Takeda rose with the military rigidity that decades of training had etched into his muscles. Other prisoners moved hesitantly, looking to each other for guidance. The American sergeant who came to escort them to breakfast seemed almost bored. There was no tension in his movements, no expectation of resistance or violence. He led them through the courtyard like a shepherd guiding sheep, gesturing with economy, and speaking in a conversational tone with his fellow guards. Takeda observed every detail, every micro-expression, searching for signs of the trap that surely awaited them. But as they neared the mess hall, only the growing aroma of fried eggs and strong coffee filled the morning air, creating a cognitive dissonance that threatened to shake his most fundamental certainties. The mess hall was spacious and well lit, with wooden tables arranged in orderly rows, and windows offering views of the fields cultivated by the prisoners themselves. Mary Collins, the nurse in charge of overseeing nutrition, watched the Japanese prisoners' entrance with professional interest disguised as casual indifference. She had studied medical reports about severe malnutrition among Imperial troops, and knew these men hadn't seen a full meal in months, perhaps years. Their gaunt faces and emaciated bodies told stories of extreme rationing and deprivations beyond what any soldier should endure. The protocol required special care in reintroducing food. Starved stomachs could violently reject a sudden abundance. However, there was something more in her interest in the Eastern prisoners, a genuine curiosity about how they would react to humane treatment after years of propaganda painting them as bloodthirsty demons. She had learned that war was also a battle of perceptions. Genji Nakamura, the youngest of the group at 19, felt his legs weaken when he saw the trays of food laid out on the service line. Steaming scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, golden toast, steaming coffee, and, impossible, jugs of fresh milk. In his 3 years of military service since being drafted from his fishing village, he had never seen such abundance gathered in one place. During the Saipan campaign, his unit had survived on handfuls of boiled rice, bitter roots, and on lucky days, dried fish as tough as leather. Kenji's contracted stomach let out an audible growl that made him flush with embarrassment. He glanced furtively at Sergeant Takeda, fearing a reprimand, but the superior officer was equally hypnotized by the sight of the food. An American soldier, noticing his hesitation, waved with a smile and pointed to the trays, gesturing for them to serve themselves freely. The young Japanese man couldn't comprehend. Where was the trick? Where was the cruelty they had been promised? Corporal John Miller had worked in the kitchen since the camp's opening 6 months earlier. The son of German immigrants, he had grown up hearing stories about the harshness of war and the importance of maintaining humanity even in the face of the enemy. When he volunteered to oversee the prisoners' food, his colleagues called him naive. Some even suggested he was wasting good food on yellow animals. Miller ignored the comments, guided by a simple philosophy he had learned from his grandfather. Even the enemy deserves a taste of home. He watched now as the Eastern prisoners approached the food line with the same mixture of hunger and suspicion he had seen in German soldiers months earlier. The difference was in their eyes. The Europeans showed resigned defeat, while the Japanese exhibited something more complex: disbelief, confusion, and a proud rigidity that prevented them from showing need. Miller decided that these men needed more than food. They needed a cultural shock that would challenge their certainties about Americans. The first bite was a revelation that transcended the mere act of eating. Takeda slowly chewed the scrambled eggs, feeling the soft texture and rich taste of real butter, not the rancid margarine he had encountered on rare occasions, but the genuine product that spoke of fat cows grazing in green fields. The crispy bacon crackled between his teeth, releasing salty fat that his starving body absorbed with desperate eagerness. Every fiber of his military being protested against this surrender to the pleasures of the flesh. But the hunger of months spoke louder than Bushido discipline. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, some with involuntary tears running down their gaunt faces. These were not tears of sadness, but of a more complex emotion, the realization that they had been lied to about the nature of their captors. Miller watched discreetly from the kitchen, pleased to see plates being cleaned with efficiency born of extreme need. These men had not eaten properly in a long time. When the trays were collected and stomachs were finally satisfied for the first time in months, a thoughtful silence descended over the mess hall. Takeda struggled against a disturbing sense of gratitude that threatened to compromise his imperial loyalty. The Americans had shown an impressive logistical ability. Feeding hundreds of prisoners abundantly was not just generosity but a display of industrial power. Every grain of well-cooked rice, every slice of soft bread, represented a war machine that could feed its enemies while still fighting on two global fronts. The subliminal message was clear. You fought against a force that could afford to be generous. Kenji, younger and less tied to rigid dogmas, felt something different. A growing curiosity about a people who treated prisoners better than the Imperial Army treated its own soldiers. Sudden war no longer seemed like a simple matter of national honor versus Western barbarism. On the Friday afternoon of the second week, Mary Collins carried out what she considered her most ambitious experiment, introducing desserts into the Japanese prisoners' daily meals. She had read anthropological reports about the scarcity of sugar in Japan during the war. Sweets were luxuries reserved for special occasions, even in peacetime, and now they had become completely inaccessible to both civilians and military. The ice cream she planned to serve was not just a dessert, but a powerful symbol of American abundance in times of global rationing. The camp's ice cream machine worked with fresh milk from nearby farms, southern sugar, and imported vanilla, ingredients that represented a supply network stretching across the continent. Collins knew she was about to confront these men with a reality that would challenge everything they had learned about their captors. The ice cream would be served in polished metal bowls, accompanied by clean spoons and white paper napkins, small details that conveyed respect and dignity. Captain Masaru Endo, the highest-ranking officer among the prisoners, watched the unusual activity in the kitchen with growing suspicion. At 42, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, he had developed sharp instincts for detecting changes in the environment that might signal danger or opportunity. The presence of extra equipment, the hurried movements of the American staff, and the sweet aroma that began to emanate from the preparation area suggested something outside the established routine. Endo had forbidden his subordinates from showing any gratitude for the treatment they had received, maintaining military discipline as a psychological barrier against American influence. However, he himself struggled with a growing curiosity about his captors' motivations. The Americans seemed genuinely concerned about the prisoners' well-being, an attitude that contradicted everything he had learned about Western mentality. That afternoon would bring a definitive test of his ability to maintain moral resistance in the face of increasingly bewildering acts of humanity. When the prisoners lined up for the afternoon meal, they found a slightly different mess hall. Wild flowers in small vases adorned some tables, and a sweet, creamy aroma filled the air, promising unknown pleasures. Kenji Nakamura's heart raced when he saw the shining metal bowls arranged at the end of the serving line, each containing a white, cold substance that gently steamed in the hot Arkansas air. Miller stood behind the counter with a smile wider than usual, clearly eager to observe their reactions. "Vanilla ice cream," he announced in broken Japanese, gesturing for them to try it. The word ice cream was familiar to some of the prisoners who had served in large cities, but most had never tasted such a delicacy. For men raised with Spartan discipline and accustomed to considering sugar an occasional luxury, the sight of such an abundant dessert represented a completely alien cultural universe. Takeda picked up his bowl with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, not from fear, but from a more complex emotion he could not name. The first spoonful touched his tongue like a cold electric shock, the creamy texture melting immediately, releasing sweet and rich flavors his military-trained palate had never experienced. It was as if all the deprivation of the past years was momentarily suspended by that small portion of frozen happiness. Around the table, other prisoners reacted with expressions ranging from silent ecstasy to deep distrust. Some refused to touch the dessert, interpreting it as a refined humiliation or a loyalty test. Kenji, less bound by rigid protocols, savored each spoonful with his eyes closed, allowing himself a moment of pleasure he hadn't felt since childhood in his fishing village. The ice cream was not just food. It was a window into a world where such luxuries were common enough to be offered even to defeated enemies. The division among the prisoners became evident as the bowls were emptied or left untouched on the tables. Endo kept his portion intact, watching it slowly melt while studying the reactions of his men. He saw experienced soldiers moved by a simple dessert, and that disturbed him deeply. Not the emotion itself, but what it represented. The ice cream was doing something that months of imperial propaganda had failed to do. It was humanizing the enemy in an irrefutable way. How could a cruel and barbaric people show such care for details, such consideration for needs that went beyond mere survival? Miller watched from the kitchen, satisfied to see that his experiment was working exactly as planned. It wasn't about political conversion or subtle propaganda. It was simply a reminder that, beneath different uniforms and ideologies, everyone shared the same basic humanity. The ice cream was his silent way of saying, "You are men, not demons, and you deserve to be treated as such." In the weeks following the ice cream incident, as Endo came to call it in his mental reports, the camp developed a complex social dynamic that neither American military manuals nor Bushido doctrine had anticipated. Informal groups formed among the prisoners, those who openly accepted American kindness, those who secretly participated but maintained a facade of resistance, and a small, irreducible minority who rejected any gesture as an enemy psychological stratagem. Takeda found himself in a particularly uncomfortable position, balancing his authority as a sergeant with a growing admiration for American organizational efficiency. He observed the guards working with professional discipline, but without the brutal rigidity that characterized the Japanese military system, and that intrigued him deeply. How could an army be effective while maintaining its humanity? The question gnawed at his certainties about Eastern moral superiority versus Western decadence. Miller continued his small culinary experiments, gradually introducing dishes that challenged the prisoners' culinary prejudices. Hamburgers, apple pie, thick milkshakes that made Eastern eyes widen in surprise. The monthly correspondence allowed by the Geneva Convention created another moral dilemma for the prisoners. Their families in Japan were facing intense bombings, severe rationing, and the constant pressure of a war approaching their homeland. How could they explain in censored letters that they were being treated better in the American prison than many civilians in Japan were in freedom? Kenji wrote to his widowed mother in Hokkaido, struggling to find words that wouldn't offend her or betray the reality of his situation. "I am in good health and receiving proper care," he finally wrote, a phrase that was technically true but omitted the bewildering abundance of his daily life. Other prisoners faced similar dilemmas, some choosing not to mention the camp's conditions, others inventing stories of forced labor to maintain coherence with family expectations. Mary Collins, who oversaw the reading of the letters as required by security rules, noticed the pattern of omissions and realized she was witnessing a particular type of psychological trauma, the guilt of being well when they were expected to be suffering. The garden the prisoners began to cultivate at the back of the camp represented a significant evolution in their adaptation to American captivity. Initially planted as a therapeutic activity suggested by military psychologist Dr. James Patterson, the project blossomed beyond all expectations when the Japanese applied traditional agricultural techniques to the Arkansas soil. Oriental vegetables grew side by side with American crops, creating a living metaphor of cultural coexistence developing in the camp. Endo supervised the work with the same meticulousness he had applied to military operations, but now his organizational talents were used to create life instead of destroying it. The smell of damp earth and young plants blended with the familiar aromas of the mess hall, creating an atmosphere that was beginning to feel more like home than a prison. Miller contributed seeds and tools, establishing a silent collaboration that transcended linguistic barriers. The garden became a neutral space where guards and prisoners could interact as human beings, interested in growing plants, not as enemies separated by fences and ideologies. The arrival of new prisoners each month created opportunities for the veterans in the camp to observe their own transformations through fresh eyes. The newcomers exhibited the same disbelief, the same fear mixed with wounded pride, that everyone had initially felt. But now, men like Takeda found themselves in the strange position of reassuring their fellow countrymen about American benevolence, a role reversal that disturbed him deeply. Was he becoming in some way an involuntary collaborator in the enemy's prison system? Or was he simply recognizing facts that imperial propaganda had obscured? Kenji, less bound by hierarchical complexities, naturally took on the role of informal mentor to the younger prisoners, teaching them the unwritten rules of life in the camp and preparing them for cultural shocks like the Friday ice cream. Dr. Patterson watched these dynamics with professional fascination, documenting how human beings adapted to situations that challenged their fundamental mental structures. The camp was becoming an unintentional laboratory for cultural reconciliation. The autumn nights brought a new dimension to life in the camp when Miller, discovering that several prisoners could play traditional instruments, organized informal musical sessions in the main courtyard. The sound of Takeda's shamisen, an instrument he had hidden from Saipan, blended strangely with American harmonicas and guitars borrowed from the guards. The music created bridges that words could not, allowing men from opposing cultures to share emotions through universal melodies. Endo initially prohibited participation in these sessions, considering them improper fraternization with the enemy, but gradually relaxed the discipline when he realized the music was raising the overall morale without compromising security. Collins often listened to the melodies from her window in the administration building, impressed by the melancholic beauty that emerged from the improbable combination of Eastern and Western musical traditions. Those nighttime sounds became the soundtrack of a transformation no one had foreseen, the discovery that enemies could become, if not friends, at least mutually respectable human beings. The first winter at Camp 314 brought a physical and emotional transformation that no military manual had anticipated. The snow covered the barracks with a white cloak, turning the landscape into something out of an American postcard, creating a silent beauty that contrasted brutally with the tropical memories of Saipan. Takeda watched the snowflakes falling through the window of his barrack, remembering the poetic descriptions of winter he had read in classical Japanese literature, but had never personally experienced. The biting cold of Arkansas was different from the damp cold of his hometown province, drier, cleaner, accompanied by a silence that allowed for deep thoughts. The Americans had distributed heavy wool coats and waterproof boots to all the prisoners, a practical gesture that again defied expectations of systematic cruelty. Each piece of warm clothing represented a financial investment in men who were supposed to be regarded as disposable enemies. Miller coordinated the distribution of hot chocolate on cold mornings, watching Japanese prisoners exhale steam from their mugs with the same simple satisfaction as children discovering new pleasures. Kenji developed a morning routine that would become his particular form of cultural resistance. He practiced martial arts kata in the snow-covered courtyard, moving with meditative precision as his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Other prisoners gradually joined him, creating a choreographed spectacle that fascinated the American guards, though they didn't fully understand its spiritual meaning. For Kenji, those movements represented a connection to ancestral traditions that the prison could not break. Each gesture was a silent affirmation of cultural identity that coexisted peacefully with the acceptance of American hospitality. Dr. Patterson documented these sessions in his reports, interpreting them as a healthy psychological preservation mechanism that did not threaten the security of the camp. The exercises became a cultural bridge when some guards began to imitate basic movements, creating moments of genuine humor when American soldiers tried to perform Eastern techniques with enthusiasm, disproportionate to their competence. Japanese martial discipline met informal American curiosity, generating an unexpected cultural hybrid. Mary Collins implemented her most ambitious project during the cold months: basic English classes for interested prisoners, held 3 times a week in the mess hall after dinner. The initiative stemmed from practical need. Better communication would facilitate daily operations, but it evolved into something deeper when she discovered that many Japanese prisoners had a genuine thirst for knowledge about American culture. Takeda reluctantly enrolled, justifying to himself that military intelligence required understanding the enemy's mindset, but secretly fascinated by the grammatical complexity of English compared to Japanese. The classes became cultural discovery labs where American concepts were explained through comparisons with Japanese equivalents, revealing unexpected similarities between peoples who considered themselves fundamentally different. Collins used culinary examples to teach vocabulary. Ice cream, was always the first expression the prisoners mastered perfectly, pronounced with involuntary smiles that betrayed positive memories associated with it. Language progress varied greatly. Kenji absorbed words with youthful ease, while older officers struggled against decades of mental rigidity that resisted the flexibility required for new languages. The American Christmas of 1944 presented the Japanese prisoners with a completely alien cultural phenomenon that, paradoxically, resonated with their own traditions of family reverence and communal celebration. Miller and his team decorated the mess hall with pine branches, paper stars, and colorful lights, transforming the utilitarian space into a festive environment that radiated human warmth even amid the harsh cold. The Christmas dinner included roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and a variety of pies representing regional American recipes, a feast that many prisoners had never imagined possible, even in freedom in Japan. Endo observed the celebration with a carefully neutral expression, but was inwardly impressed by the generosity that transcended basic military obligations. The Americans were sharing sacred traditions with captured enemies, including them in rituals that defined national cultural identity. Some prisoners contributed with traditional Japanese songs, creating a multilingual choir that echoed through the camp as audible proof that shared humanity could overcome political and racial divisions. The music became a universal language where Silent Night harmonized strangely with Bon Festival melodies, creating a soundtrack for an unlikely reconciliation. The letters that arrived from Japan during that winter brought increasingly grim news about intensified bombings, severe food shortages, and declining civilian morale. Takeda read reports from his wife about rice rationing reduced to portions barely enough to sustain children, while he had gained weight from the abundant American diet. The irony of the situation created a complex guilt that kept him awake during the cold nights in Arkansas. How could he explain to hungry relatives that he was better fed as a prisoner of war than many civilians in free Japan? Other prisoners faced similar dilemmas, some opting for voluntary fasts in symbolic solidarity with their compatriots suffering in Japan. Collins noticed the reduced appetite of several men and intuitively understood the source of the problem, discreetly implementing smaller but more nutritious portions to accommodate cultural sensitivities without compromising health. Dr. Patterson conducted informal counseling sessions where prisoners could express psychological conflicts without fearing military reprisals. The American winter had become a season of forced introspection, where men confronted contradictions between national loyalty and lived reality, discovering that true patriotism sometimes required acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths about enemies who turned out to be more human than propaganda allowed them to admit. The spring of 1945 arrived at Camp 314, loaded with meanings that transcended simple seasonal changes, bringing with it fragmentary news about the intensification of the war in the Pacific and whispered rumors about new American weapons of devastating power. The garden the prisoners had planted the previous autumn bloomed with renewed vigor, displaying a unique mix of Oriental and American vegetables growing side by side, as a living metaphor for the cultural coexistence blossoming in the camp. Takeda supervised the cultivation of daikon radishes among rows of American corn, applying traditional Japanese agricultural techniques adapted to Arkansas soil with surprisingly productive results. The horticultural collaboration had become a joint project where American guards learned Eastern crop rotation methods, while prisoners discovered native vegetable varieties they never imagined existed. Miller contributed with experimental hybrid seeds obtained from the state university, turning the garden into an intercultural agricultural laboratory. The scent of damp earth and young shoots mixed with the familiar smells of the kitchen, creating a springtime atmosphere that symbolized renewal and unexpected possibilities born from improbable circumstances. Kenji celebrated his 20th birthday that spring, with a modest celebration that revealed the evolution of his perspective on captivity and national identity. Collins organized a small surprise party in the mess hall, complete with a homemade chocolate cake decorated with 20 candles and a bilingual version of Happy Birthday, sung by an unlikely choir of Japanese prisoners and American guards. The young soldier was genuinely moved by the display of affection that transcended cultural and military barriers. No Japanese superior had ever shown personal interest in his individual well-being, but these enemies cared enough to remember intimate details of his life with authentic affection. During the small celebration, Kenji reflected on the transformations that had occurred over 12 months of captivity. He had arrived as an imperial fanatic, prepared for a glorious death, but had discovered that living with dignity among respectful adversaries offered lessons more valuable than dramatic martyrdom. The party became a symbolic milestone of maturity that occurred not despite the prison, but because of the humanizing experiences it had provided. Miller watched the young Japanese man blow out the candles with paternal satisfaction, remembering his own son serving in the European theater, and hoping that some German enemy would show similar humanity if fortune turned against American forces. News of intensified bombings in Japan created a complex atmosphere in the camp, mixing the prisoners' genuine concern with growing guilt over their relatively comfortable situation. Fragmentary reports of attacks on Japanese cities arrived through censored letters and radio bulletins that the guards shared discreetly, painting a devastating picture of civil destruction that contrasted brutally with the pastoral peace of Arkansas. Endo found himself in a particularly difficult position as the senior officer responsible for the morale of his men. How could he maintain military discipline when evidence suggested the war was lost, and their families were facing growing dangers while they lived in relative safety? Dr. Patterson observed increasing symptoms of depression and anxiety among prisoners, conducting group therapy sessions disguised as cultural discussions, where men could express emotional conflicts without compromising military dignity. The conversations revealed the depth of guilt that went beyond mere survival. Many felt like involuntary traitors for developing genuine respect for their American captors. Collins contributed by offering opportunities for prisoners to send non-perishable food packages to families in Japan, a gesture that violated technical regulations, but addressed the urgent psychological need to contribute to the well-being of distant loved ones. The expanded correspondence project that Collins initiated in the spring allowed for deeper cultural exchanges between prisoners and the local community, creating human connections that challenged mutual perceptions of the enemy's nature. Rural Arkansas families began exchanging letters with Japanese prisoners, sharing everyday aspects of American life that war propaganda had never conveyed. Regional recipes, photographs of harvests, stories about community festivals, and universal concerns about children serving overseas. Takeda established regular correspondence with a local farmer whose son was serving in the Pacific, discovering surprising parallels between paternal anxieties that transcended national and racial differences. The letters revealed that American soldiers in the Eastern Theater faced similar challenges to those he had experienced: homesickness, uncertainty about the future, difficulties adapting to foreign cultures. The American farmer described agricultural techniques that echoed traditional Japanese methods, suggesting that practical human knowledge followed universal patterns, regardless of geographical origin. These epistolary exchanges became laboratories of mutual discovery, where cultural stereotypes were gradually replaced by a nuanced understanding of the human complexities that existed beyond propaganda and national prejudice. The arrival of new prisoners captured at Iwo Jima and Okinawa brought first-hand reports of the desperate intensification of Japanese resistance, but also confirmation of rumors about the consistently humane treatment offered by American forces to enemy combatants who surrendered. The veterans of Camp 314 naturally took on the role of cultural guides, preparing newcomers for the shocks of abundance and kindness that awaited them in American captivity. Takeda found himself explaining mess hall protocols and camp rules with authority born from experience, not hierarchical imposition, a personal transformation that impressed him with the subtlety with which it had occurred. Kenji demonstrated basic conversational English techniques to younger soldiers, conveying linguistic enthusiasm that would have been considered cultural betrayal months before. Miller expanded culinary operations to accommodate larger groups, maintaining quality standards that continued to surprise men accustomed to Japanese military scarcity. The Friday ice cream had become an eagerly anticipated institutional tradition for both veteran and new prisoners alike, symbolizing the complete transformation of a humiliation symbol into a source of simple but meaningful pleasure. Spring had brought not only natural renewal but increasing evidence that enmity based on mutual ignorance could be overcome through prolonged exposure to shared humanity that existed beyond uniforms and political ideologies. The announcement of Japan's surrender in August 1945 reached Camp 314 through radio waves that instantly transformed the atmosphere, replacing established routines with uncertainty about futures no military manual had predicted. Takeda listened to Emperor Hirohito's words through loudspeakers installed in the central courtyard, feeling decades of imperial devotion crumble like sandcastles struck by inexorable waves. The divine voice that had commanded the ultimate sacrifice was now admitting defeat and requesting acceptance of foreign occupation, a historical irony that made his own experience of humanitarian captivity an involuntary preparation for the realities awaiting all of Japan. Around him, other prisoners reacted with stunned silence, some openly crying while others maintained military rigidity that masked the internal collapse of fundamental mental structures. Miller watched from the kitchen with a solemn expression, understanding that he was witnessing a historic moment where men confronted the collapse of everything they had believed in. Collins moved discreetly between groups of prisoners, offering compassionate presence without words that might seem condescending in a moment of extreme vulnerability. The war had officially ended, but the real battle, the reconstruction of shattered identities, was just beginning. Kenji experienced the news of surrender with conflicting feelings that reflected his transformation during months of American captivity. On one hand, he felt profound relief that the bombings would cease and his family would finally be safe. On the other, he recognized that the Japan he had known likely no longer existed, replaced by an occupied reality that would challenge the cultural traditions that defined his identity. During solitary walks through the garden he had helped cultivate, he contemplated hybrid vegetables growing vigorously in American soil, a perfect metaphor for the cultural adaptations he himself had undergone without fully realizing it. The Japanese plants had thrived in foreign soil, not by abandoning essential characteristics, but by adapting to new conditions in ways that allowed for sustainable growth. Perhaps, he reflected, military defeat did not mean cultural annihilation, but an opportunity for synthesis that preserved fundamental values while incorporating positive aspects of foreign civilizations. Miller found him in these reflections one afternoon, offering extra ice cream as a gesture of silent comfort that communicated empathetic understanding more eloquently than words. The young Japanese man accepted the dessert with genuine gratitude, recognizing that this simple American had taught lessons about human dignity that no military manual had ever conveyed. The war was over, but the friendships forged in unlikely circumstances would remain as bridges between cultures that had discovered shared humanity beyond superficial differences. The process of repatriation revealed the depth of the psychological transformations that had occurred during years of humanitarian captivity, confronting ex-prisoners with the prospect of returning to a society that did not share their experiences of peaceful coexistence with former enemies. Endo faced a particular dilemma as a senior officer. How could he explain to Japanese authorities that he had allowed fraternization with American captors without compromising military honor or the safety of his subordinates? During preparation sessions conducted by Dr. Patterson, prisoners expressed anxieties about reintegrating into a culture that might interpret their survival and adaptation as implicit betrayal of imperial ideals. Collins organized farewell ceremonies where guards and prisoners exchanged addresses and promises of future correspondence, creating international friendship networks that transcended political boundaries. Takeda gifted Miller his shamisen as a symbol of gratitude for the treatment that had redefined his understanding of human nature, while receiving in return a handwritten recipe for vanilla ice cream, a culinary memento of the deep transformations experienced in foreign land. The farewells were marked by genuine emotion, that surprised participants on both sides, confirming that artificial enmity imposed by governments could be overcome through shared experiences of mutual respect and human dignity. Camp 314 had become an unintentional laboratory for international reconciliation where men discovered that cultural differences enriched rather than threatened national identities when approached. With an open mind and a generous heart, the journey back to Japan offered a final time of reflection on experiences that had fundamentally redefined the worldview of men who had departed as imperial fanatics and returned as involuntary ambassadors of peaceful, international coexistence possibilities. Takeda watched the American coasts disappear on the horizon, with mixed feelings, relief at returning, home tempered by an unexpected nostalgia for the captivity routines that had provided stability and purpose amid global chaos. During conversations on the transport ship, ex-prisoners shared stories that revealed consistent patterns of humane treatment in American camps, contrasting dramatically with the propaganda that had prepared them for systematic brutality. Kenji documented experiences in an improvised diary, recording lessons learned about the importance of judging people by individual actions rather than national stereotypes. The notes would later become the foundation for lectures he would give at Japanese schools, educating future generations on the complexities of international relations that transcended militaristic simplifications. Miller had packed extra supplies of chocolate and preserves as farewell gifts, practical gestures that communicated continued care, even after official responsibilities had ended. The ocean separating America from Japan was no longer an insurmountable cultural chasm, but a potential bridge for mutual understanding, based on the recognition of shared humanity that existed beyond the artificial borders created by temporary political conflicts. Years later, when veterans of Camp 314 gathered at reunions organized by former prisoners' associations, their stories became powerful testimonies of the possibilities for transformation that emerged from less likely circumstances. Total war turned into an opportunity for deep cultural discovery. Takeda established an import business facilitating commercial exchange between Japan and Arkansas, maintaining regular correspondence with rural American families that had shown kindness during years of captivity. Collins published an anthropological study on cultural adaptations observed in the camp, contributing to academic literature that would influence future policies for treating prisoners of war. Kenji became an interpreter for the American occupation, applying language skills developed in evening classes in the camp's mess hall to facilitate communication between cultures that were gradually learning to coexist with mutual respect. Dr. Patterson developed psychological protocols for the reintegration of ex-prisoners based on observations made during the humanitarian administration of Camp 314, recognizing that war trauma could be mitigated through treatment that preserved individual dignity, even in circumstances of military defeat. The Friday ice cream became a lasting symbol in the collective memories of the veterans, not only as a dessert, but as a representation of the discovery that enemies could turn out to be more human than propaganda allowed one to imagine, and that small gestures of kindness possessed a transformative power that surpassed grand military strategies in building genuine peace between peoples who shared fundamental aspirations for safety, prosperity, and dignity for their families.